All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So get these slides going. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak here. And thanks everyone for joining. So yeah, this title is a bit of a bit lengthy, but basically the idea was we wanted to put a neural network inside of a process-based hydrologic model and kind of see how that, if we could actually do that and how that works out. And so this was sort of the last half of my PhD work with Bart Nyssen at the University of Washington. And so I'll just jump right into it. So when we're talking about kind of putting together a hydrologic model, it's often you kind of start with this conceptual model of all of these different processes, and then you kind of relate how they interact. And so, as I have already kind of said, and in the title, the main idea here is we want to replace just a couple of these processes with neural network sort of parameterizations. And so this will interact with all of the other sort of either physics or empirically based relationships that are already encoded in the model. And so here I have it highlighted as transpiration and evaporation, but I'm actually going to quickly reframe things in terms of energy fluxes rather than mass fluxes. So the energy balance at the land surface can be kind of represented in this simple schematic where you have net radiation incoming to the land surface, and then that's partitioned into a sensible heat flux, which is sort of conductive heat transport, a latent heat flux, which is evaporative transport, so kind of the counterpart to evaporation and transpiration from plants. And then there's a ground heat flux, which we are not representing with any sort of machine learning, but rather that's going to be handled by the rest of the hydrologic model. And so, we're in the hydrology session, and kind of in the intro, there's a lot of talk about flooding and maybe some drought and water resources stuff. So why am I talking about heat fluxes here? This is sort of the main coupling between the land and the atmosphere. And so as you evaporate water, you start to partition more energy into heating up the land surface. And with climate change, there are feedbacks that end up becoming pretty important and can lead to a lot of different effects. And further, these sort of evaporation and transpiration terms are actually a really large part of the water cycle. They actually account for more sort of total mass flux than the amount of water that flows in rivers. And so taking this into account and having good predictions is pretty important on the large scale. And because of that, there's been some previous studies where these sort of statistical, either machine learning or other sorts of data-driven methods have been shown that, we can outperform our current process understanding at sort of the landscape scale. And so it's pretty telling that we should kind of be trying to use these techniques and learn from them if we want to have robust predictions. And so to do that, we kind of start with gathering all of our data up. We ended up taking data from FluxNet sites, which provide sort of gold standard measurements at sort of the landscape or ecosystem scale. And we ended up with over sort of 500 site years of half-hourly data. So it's a somewhat large data set, maybe not for machine learning, but it is for hydrology. And so you can see we've got a pretty good coverage of different sort of landscape types by the different dots, but of course, by no means is this representative of the entire globe. So, if we can get more data, I'm sure we can do even better than we're currently doing. So we gather all this data. It has these observations of both the sensible and latent heat flux, and then also kind of a bunch of other meteorological data that we can use to run our hydrologic model and train our machine learning models. So things like temperature, precipitation, incoming radiation, humidity, things like that. And so we take all of this data and we're going to do some modeling experiment. So kind of the hydrologic modeling framework we use is called Suma. It's not particularly important that all of the details are explained, but the main thing here is that it's kind of a multi-physics modeling framework. So that's kind of what let us take out the turbulent heat flux representation of sort of the traditional process-based understanding and put in some neural networks. And so that's what we're going to do. We have 3 different model configurations in this study, but they're all kind of based around the Suma modeling framework. So this works kind of like any other land surface, hydrologic, or earth system type model, where you have some inputs, which may be parameters, and some forcing data, in our case, meteorology. And then that goes into the model, and you compute some fluxes like runoff or turbulent heat fluxes, as we will do here. These are actually all calculated. And then those fluxes are used to update model states, which would be things like the temperature of the canopy, the amount of water in the soil, and then you kind of iteratively update that in time. And so we're just going to modify this purple box here with 3 different configurations. The first we're calling SA for standalone. This is basically Suma off the shelf. It uses a ball and berry type approach for these turbulent heat fluxes. And it takes in the parameters, forcing data, and then it can use some of the other derived fluxes and states to calculate these partitioned heat fluxes. Now, our first neural network or deep learning based approach is, we're calling it NN one way, because it does not take any information from Suma. It only takes in the meteorological forcing data and then outputs these heat fluxes in bulk terms. So we don't partition it between like the canopy and the ground domains. And that's just because that's what's observed. So we kind of have to simplify our representation for this case. And then those outputted heat fluxes are going to be used to update the model states in Suma, and that runs forward in time. And so you can probably kind of see if we've got a one-way coupling where the neural network can talk to Suma, but Suma can't talk to the neural network. The next step would be to introduce a two-way coupling. So in two-way, we actually introduce some new inputs, which are Suma-derived states, things like the amount of soil moisture that's stored, things like the kind of canopy temperature. And so that is our last model configuration. And this is all, I just want to make this very clear, this is all running online inside of Suma, sort of at runtime. We're not like switching out between run a time step of Suma, run a time step of the neural networks. So we had to actually embed these neural networks inside of a Fortran code base. And to do that, I just want to give a little plug to Fortran Character, which is the software package developed by Ott et al. That was really nice to be able to do this. It only allows for some sort of simple representations of neural networks right now, but if anyone else is interested in getting started trying to do these types of experiments, this is a good way to go. Okay, so we train the models and calibrate and everything. So just to describe that a little bit for each of the model configurations. For the standalone or SA model, we calibrate this at each of those 60 FluxNet sites individually. So we're trying to find the best parameter set to get the best predictive performance for that particular site. So this is in sample calibration, and it's sort of our benchmark. It's kind of like the best case scenario, or how you would traditionally do a hydrologic modeling experiment. And then for both the NN1 and 2-way, we actually trained the neural network out of sample using a 5-fold cross-validation. So when we run the actual results, this is the predictions are made on sites that the neural networks were not trained on. So this is more of how you would traditionally do like a data science or machine learning type of experiment. So we kind of tried to pick the way that you would do each to give a representative comparison. And so when we do this, sort of the high level result is that both of the neural network parameterizations outperformed the SA model for both of the heat fluxes. And so what I'm showing here is the cumulative distribution of the performance as calculated by the KGE, which is sort of a combination of the bias, the variance, and the correlation of the predictions to the observations. And so it's rescaled so that a 1 is a perfect simulation. So these curves, the further to the right that they fall, the better performance overall. And so these curves are made up of the 60 sites. So there are 60 points on each of these curves here. So you can see that both the red and the orange lines are further to the right by, maybe about 0.2-ish on the KGE scale. So it's a pretty wide margin here. And you might be able to say, if you squint at this NN2 way, you might say the latent heat is a little bit better than even NN1 way. And so that kind of is something that we dove into a little bit. And sort of, we were trying to look at this sort of from a hydrologic perspective. And what we found was the inclusion of those soil states. So the actual amount of moisture in the soil actually improves the long-term water balance over the one-way coupled neural network. And so how we examined that was we looked at the long-term evaporative fraction, which is the total amount of evaporation and transpiration divided by the total amount of precipitation. So this is over the entire simulation period, which was a minimum of 3 years for any site. But some sites had up to 10 or 14 years. So in these plots, on the x-axis is the observed fraction, and then on the y-axis is the simulated. So when we get a perfect simulation, it would fall right on this 1-to-1 line. And then we've colored each of these dots, which is by the KGE score in the previous slide. So with SA, you can see as you get closer to this 1-to-1 line, you get better performance. So that's indicating that this is a good diagnostic as well. And you see there's mostly under evaporation, some slight over, but it's mostly under. On the other hand, neural network one way does not have any understanding of how much actual water it has available to evaporate. So it tends to over evaporate and kind of draw down the soil moisture over time. But it does it kind of clusters on the 1-to-1 line, but has both over and under evaporation. And then by telling the neural network actually how much water is available in the soil, it kind of figures out when it needs to tamp down on how much evaporation is going on. So this is sort of a nice indication that, we might be able to impart some sort of some nudges to make neural networks learn sort of what we want them to by giving them the right sorts of data. And so just to drop a sort of conclusion slide for this so far, this was kind of our first pass at getting this coupling to work. And, these neural networks were able to outperform the standalone model in terms of these latent heat fluxes and latent sensible heat fluxes. So this indicates that, maybe we should continue moving in this direction, get more sophisticated machine learning models, start analyzing them a little bit more. And kind of this coupling allows us to include feedbacks sort of dynamically that sort of help enforce these constraints without having to encode them directly. So for instance, that soil moisture state led to better predictions of the long-term evaporative fraction. And so if you want to see some more details, we just got this study published in WRR. It's got sort of analysis going on that you can dive into if you're interested. But with that, this is sort of, like I said, the first pass, but there's a lot that can be done here. So I'd like to just kind of give two other things that we're looking at. So there's a lot of interest in this, in getting explainable or interpretable methods going, so we can actually start to learn or build trustworthiness of our models. And so we kind of had the same question. We wanted to know, in particular, the neural networks generalized better than a traditional hydrologic model would, and we really would like to know why that is. What can we learn from it? And further, are we going to be confident that if we apply this to new sites that are maybe not inside of our training data set, or like similar to that, will our predictions hold up? So to do that, we used a technique called layer-wise relevance propagation. There were a few talks about this yesterday, but sort of the high level of this, once you have a trained model, sort of this top section of the diagram, you can run it in forward mode to make predictions. You give some input and you get some output. Then LRP lets you kind of take a sort of a mathematical rule that you can back propagate information back through the network for a given output, and sort of partition relevance, which will go kind of through each layer all the way back to your inputs. And what you get is sort of a numerical score of attribution for why the neural network made the prediction. So we did this for a similar, but not exactly the same neural network as NN2A. And I'm not going to go through all of the results here, but I just want to kind of show, what kinds of things you can start to look at here. So I'm taking a single site. This is a desert shrubland site near Tucson, Arizona, where I will actually be starting in a postdoc. So it's been kind of fun to dive into this area. So in the top panel here of the gray, we have some of the inputs, the time series inputs to the neural network. And then these two right boxes show the predictions in red and the observations in black. So just to kind of get a sense of what is going on. Then we take this LRP technique, propagate our relevance scores back, and that's what I'm showing in these bottom four panels. So we have one time series score for the sensible heat, orange, and one blue one for the latent heat. And so you can kind of see how these, there are some patterns here. Just to be sort of quick about it, I'll highlight this moisture relevance time series. We can see during the time when there's low soil moisture, there's not a lot of relevance. So the neural network is basically saying, I don't know what to do with this soil moisture score. It's not really helping me determine what to do. And then as soon as we get these summer monsoons where we see a soil moisture, the neural network starts to actually attribute some importance to this. And we see sort of a really highly anti-correlated signal here. And so you can kind of think about this as the neural network partitioning between latent and sensible heat. So it's basically saying, I have moisture now, I should do evaporation rather than heat up the soil. And so this is, this is just one site across a range of aridity. So sites further to the left here are more energy limited. They typically have the moisture available for evaporation, and sites over on the right here are more arid and might be more moisture limited. So that Tucson site is way over here, and you can see that high anti-correlation falls, highly to the lower end. And as you have sort of more water available in the system, this partitioning becomes less and less important to the network. So it's kind of like showing here that the neural network actually learns that for highly arid sites, this partitioning kind of, and this is something that we encoded. We didn't give either precipitation or the sort of long-term aridity to the network. This is something that it kind of learned on its own. So this is one way we can kind of say the neural network gains a little bit of trust here. I'm not going to say that I trust it fully, completely everywhere, but this is one way that we might be able to start building some trust. And there's a bunch of other cool things you can do with this technique. But in the interest of time, there's a second sort of set of questions that we're starting to ask is, why do we need to actually oversimplify these neural networks and not partitioning? So as I said in the beginning, the SA model has this kind of different domains of the soil and the vegetation. And that's definitely how we know nature kind of works. But we don't measure that at sort of a large scale. So with the neural networks, we kind of had to simplify this, but this is a knowledge guided machine learning workshop. So, can we inject some physics in to actually get that partitioning back out? And can we learn from that? So what we're starting to look at here is we want to add some sort of physics that we know, and we're doing that via a heat flux equation layer, I'm calling it here, where we encode some of the physics that we are assuming that we can use. So here we have partitioning these heat fluxes. And instead of directly simulating the heat fluxes with the neural network, we're going to simulate some conductances as shown by these sort of underlined terms. So then once we encode this in a machine learning framework, which we've done, we've written this sort of layer in TensorFlow, we can train this whole sort of model end to end and start to get out these sort of unobserved partitionings. And sort of the early results here indicate that this can actually work, and the network can learn some reasonable partitioning. So again, on the left, we have that site near Tucson. We see there's a lot more ground evaporation going on than transpiration or canopy evaporation. So that's, kind of follows your intuition based on what you're seeing in this picture here. And then for a forested site, we see a lot more transpiration in yellow and canopy evaporation. So this is, this is not perfect. We're really starting to look at, what else should we include to kind of get this partitioning? What can we make the neural network use? Maybe some fractional vegetation, some sort of remote sense sort of time series of LAI or NDVI, so stuff like that. So we're hoping that we can kind of get this to be something that can run, and we can actually get kind of this partitioning back, so we don't have to simplify things. So with that, I just want to kind of wrap it up and say, this coupling, you can get to work, and it opens up a lot of things that you can start to do with this, and building sort of these XAI techniques will make this more robust, and kind of imparting this physical theory. Like, these are kind of all kind of things that I think need to move in lockstep together to actually make this more robust and kind of usable for sort of operation or broader use. So with that, take some questions. If you're interested, I've got the R paper and the preprint for the LRP stuff that is currently in revision there, but happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. I got time for maybe one question, I think, maybe two. So the first one is, how does the compute time compare for the 3 configurations of Suma?
Yeah, so this is actually kind of an interesting part. The compute time for the neural networks is actually much longer. It's about 2 times as long as the SA simulation. And it's not necessarily because the neural network is slower. It's because we've got this sort of iterative sub-stepping in solving the rest of the PD system in Suma. And because the neural networks don't have necessarily good or accurate sort of partial derivatives with respect to what a Newton's method would have, you end up doing a lot of iterative subsets. So this is something that we're actually trying to improve on too.
Okay. I think that we probably should move on, but Andrew, I'll supply you with the there are a couple of other questions, and maybe you could answer those a bit later. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.